Hi, and welcome to Bella's Vistas. Mary, Bella, and I have been traveling North America in search of good times and great photographs. Why not follow along on our adventures? Please like and subscribe.
Well, hi there. Thanks for visiting. Today I'm going to do something totally different. I'm going to take sort of a busman's holiday. My friend Brian Townsend is teaching a photography course in Fundy Park. I'm going to tag along and see what I can learn. Come on along.
Well, Brian explained the concept behind his photography course to me. Basically, he wanted to make sure that everyone would have good pictures of Fundy Park, that they would be as good as possible, and that would help everyone concerned. Here Brian showed some pictures that he took with the first camera that he ever had. He explained how as long as the sun was over your left shoulder, your pictures would be fine. Now, if you want to get pictures under different situations, you're going to have to adjust your exposure compensation dial on the camera. Brian had excellent examples of photographs that required this, and he showed everyone how to do it with their own camera. The photographs showed when you needed more exposure, less exposure, and Brian explained how to check this on the histogram of your camera. The histogram is a very good way to make sure that you've got an excellent exposure. Here's an array of cameras that Brian was showing people how to use. Everyone brought their own cameras and was able to adjust the compensation on the back of their camera. Here we have a couple Canons. Other cameras were there as well. We've got a Canon, a GoPro, and another Canon model. Here Brian is explaining some of the fine details of exposure. The menus on the back of the camera, every camera is different, and Brian spent considerable time learning about the menus on the various cameras. He gave everyone a little white card that they could use to set the white balance on their camera. When you have a correct preset white balance, the colors are going to be right. This is a commercially available white balance card that's made of plastic, and it lasts for a very long time. You see here some mushrooms, and when the white balance is correct, the color of the mushrooms will be right. Now we're talking about composition, the weight of various objects in the photograph and how to position things. The need of a foreground object to bring depth into the photograph, to actually make the person feel like they're standing right in the photograph instead of looking at it from a long distance away. Brian went to great depths and brought many samples of various photographs showing how the inclusion of a foreground object in the composition made it feel like you were walking into the photograph instead of just looking at it from a distance. Now Brian's showing the diaphragm of a camera to explain the depth of field. A wide aperture, less depth of field; a tight aperture, more depth of field. Here we're looking at some photographs and seeing the difference that the correct depth of field will make. Everyone was very attentive and enjoyed the course immensely. I certainly did. Brian's explaining leading lines in composition, how a curve or an arc or a vertical line can draw you into the photograph. It's obvious that Brian worked very hard on this. Look at the stack of photographs he's got. Here we're looking at a photograph, and the foreground object leads you into the photograph and makes you feel part of the scene. It makes it a much more visual experience instead of looking at a flat photograph. The color and composition, of course, are very important. The weight of objects, the leading lines. Brian's explaining a little more about the camera depth of field, how you could have a narrow depth of field or a longer depth of field, how you would keep more in focus or less in focus, how the cars here might be in focus and the background would be out of focus. And this would provide more depth in the image. You don't always want everything to be sharp. Sometimes you want everything to be sharp, but sometimes you want a narrow depth of field so you'll experience more depth in the photograph. One of my friends was saying recently that all the photographs he sees now, everything is perfectly sharp. And he said that's just not the way it used to be. He said, you know, if you shoot at f5.6, you'd have less depth of field. And I said, well, you can still do things that way. Here's a modern depth of field calculator on an iPhone. This is using the most modern technology to show you exactly what depth of field you'll have in your photograph. You can adjust for narrow depth of field to have more of a depth presence, or a wide depth of field to show most of things sharply. Now we're talking about leading lines into the photograph, how these lines will draw you in and show you how you'll experience more depth of field in the photographs. Brian talks a lot about depth of field in his nature shots. These flower photographs, depth of field can be very important. You might want to see everything sharp, you might not want everything to be sharp. The weight of objects in the photograph. A dark object has more weight than a light object, and where you put that, you don't want your picture to feel like it's leaning off to one side. Brian was very specific about some of these things. Your photograph might feel like you're leaning to the left or the right. It won't be comfortable. Here's a leading curve, a curve leading into the photograph. You could have converging lines bringing you in, a curve, an arc, an S-curve, the golden spiral, rule of thirds. These are all composition terms Brian explained to us. These rules have been known since they built the pyramids. The pyramids are built to the 4/3 rule. Here's a line drawing you into the photograph. Here's the foreground bringing you in. Brian talked about moving your feet. Now in the past I'd heard about imagining a 100-foot cord that had you spiked to the tripod and you would move around until you saw the object from various positions and picked out where you want. Now we went off to the beach to take some photographs. We all took the same course, everybody learned all the same things, but as soon as we got there, everybody took off and did their own thing, and it's amazing. Everybody had a different idea that they wanted to try. Some with the foreground framing, using an object in the foreground to bring depth. Other people were doing close-ups on rocks and things on the beach. Brian seemed to have his own ideas about what he wanted to do, getting the rocks in the foreground, the ship in the background, and the mist. He really enjoys photographing the mist and the fog. Everybody is taking their own photographs. They're using the knowledge they learned and going out and applying it to different things. These are some of my photographs. I wanted a strong foreground to see the mist over the boat and the point of land. The rocks in the beginning, I have some of them sharp, some of them not so sharp, and the background is sharp. There's some mist though that makes aerial perspective. Here I'm using people for the foreground in my photograph to show depth. Brian's working with his iPhone. He does a lot of photography with the phone as well as with his cameras. Here Brian's evaluating one of the students' photographs, talking about the composition. This is the kind of thing I like to photograph. I'm wild about the boats and the sea and the rocks in the foreground. I suggested that we moved some of the rocks around a little bit, but Brian said it was easier for us to just move our feet, and that's exactly what he did. striking some pretty mean poses up on top of the rocks here to get exactly what he wanted to see. Here everybody's working away on their own ideas. This fella lives about 3 kilometers from where I live, and he was off photographing the rocks. Here we're getting a little steadying action there on the rocks.
Well, wow, I had a great time. I also learned a lot. Some of the things were refreshers for me, but I did learn some composition ideas, things about balance, and a new idea about moving your feet.